The sun hung low over the abandoned town when Samuel first saw her beneath the old cottonwood tree, and his heart caught in his chest at the sight before him. She was wrapped in what looked like a torn bedsheet stained with dirt and what might have been blood, and her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her eyes were the eyes of a frightened animal. And Samuel had seen that look before in his 63 years, and it never got easier to witness. His horse stamped softly behind him, and the woman flinched at the sound and pulled the fabric tighter around herself, and Samuel raised both hands, slowly showing her his palms. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, and his voice came out rougher than he intended so. He cleared his throat and tried again. "My name is Samuel, and I have a ranch about 5 miles east of here, and I was just passing through looking for stray cattle." The woman said nothing, and her lips were cracked and dry, and Samuel could see she was trembling, though the afternoon was warm. He took a small step forward, and she shrank back against the tree trunk, and he stopped immediately. "When did you last have water?" he asked. Still, she said nothing, and just stared at him with those wide, frightened eyes. Samuel slowly reached for his canteen and unscrewed the cap and held it out at arm's length and set it on the ground between them, and then he stepped back several paces. "It's just water," he said. "Clean well water from my place, and you can have it all." For a long moment she didn't move, and then slowly, cautiously, she reached out one bare arm, and her hand shook as she grabbed the canteen and pulled it to her, and she drank deeply and desperately, and water ran down her chin. And next Samuel waited and let his eyes drift to the abandoned buildings behind her. And this town had been called Hope's End once, and that was 40 years ago, when the railroad decided to go a different route, and now it was just weathered wood, and broken windows and memories of what might have been. When she lowered the canteen, she was breathing hard and looking at him with slightly less fear and slightly more calculation. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice was like dry leaves. "You're welcome," Samuel said, and he kept his tone gentle and even. "Are you hurt?" She didn't answer right away, and her eyes dropped to the ground. "I can see you've been through something," he continued carefully, "and I won't ask what if you don't want to. Tell, and I won't touch you if you don't want to be touched, but I do think you need help." "I'm fine," she said, and it was the oldest lie in the world. Samuel nodded slowly and glanced at the sky where the sun was getting lower. "It gets cold out here at night," he said. "Even in summer, and there's nothing in these buildings but rattlesnakes and memories, and I have a guest room at my ranch, and my housekeeper Margaret makes a stew that could bring a man back from the dead, and no one will bother you there, and you can leave whenever you want." "Why would you help me?" she asked, and there was suspicion in her voice and pain. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," Samuel said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." She studied his face for a long time, and he let her look, and he knew what she would see. And a weathered man with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunrises, and a sadness that lived deep down that he mostly kept hidden. "I don't even know you," she said. "That's true," Samuel agreed. "My full name is Samuel James Cooper, and I've lived in these parts for 38 years, and I run about 200 head of cattle, and I lost my wife Eleanor to cancer 6 years ago, and I have a daughter named Sarah who lives in Denver and calls me every Sunday. And my dog is named Buster, and he's old and lazy and won't hurt a fly." Despite everything, the woman's lips twitched slightly, and it wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. "My housekeeper Margaret has been with me for 12 years, and she lives in the cottage behind the main house, and she'll vouch for me if you need her to. And she's about as tough as they come, and doesn't take nonsense from anyone, including me." The woman looked down at the canteen in her hands and then back at Samuel. "What if I said no?" she asked quietly. "Then I'd leave you the canteen and some food if you'll accept it, and I'd ride back tomorrow to check on you, and the day after that if needed, and until you either accepted help or ran me off for good." She closed her eyes, and Samuel saw her shoulders sag, and the weight of whatever she was carrying seemed to press down on her. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't let anyone near me." "That's all right," Samuel said gently. "You don't have to, and I can walk 20 feet ahead of you all the way back if that makes you feel safer, and you can ride my horse and I'll walk." "Please don't touch me," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Please." "I won't," Samuel promised. "I give you my word, and I've never broken it yet. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and something in his face must have convinced her because she nodded once, and it was barely a movement. Okay, she breathed. Samuel felt relief wash through him, but he kept his expression calm. What should I call you? He asked. She hesitated and then said, Grace, and it's Grace. All right, Grace. Samuel said, Let's get you somewhere safe. The journey back to the ranch took nearly 2 hours because they moved slowly, and Samuel walked ahead with his horse trailing behind him, and Grace followed at a distance, and she clutched that stained sheet around herself like armor. Samuel didn't try to make conversation, and he just walked steadily and occasionally glanced back to make sure she was still there. And every time she was, and her bare feet moving carefully over the dusty ground. When the ranch house came into view, Grace stopped, and Samuel stopped too, and turned to face her. That's home, he said. The main house is where I live, and that smaller building with the blue door is where Margaret stays, and the barn is to the left, and we have 3 horses, besides the one I'm leading, and 4 barn cats, and Buster, who you'll meet soon enough. Grace stared at the house, and it was a simple ranch-style building with a wide porch and white paint that Samuel touched up every few years and flowers that Margaret planted in boxes by the windows. It's quiet, she said, and it sounded like that was a good thing. It is. Samuel agreed. Most of the time it's just me and Margaret and the animals and the occasional ranch hand who comes to help with the heavy work. They started moving again, and as they got closer, the front door opened and Margaret stepped out onto the porch, and she was a sturdy woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun, and she wore an apron over her dress. Margaret took one look at Grace and her expression shifted from curiosity to understanding, and she came down the steps slowly. Samuel, she said. Margaret, this is Grace. Samuel said, She's going to be staying in the guest room for a while, and she's had a rough time and needs some peace and quiet. Margaret's eyes were kind and knowing, and she'd seen enough of life to recognize trauma when it stood before her. Hello, Grace, she said warmly, but she kept her distance. I'm Margaret, and I'm very glad you're here, and would you like to come inside and get cleaned up? And I have clothes that will fit you, and I can heat some water for a bath. Grace looked between them, and her eyes were wet. Why are you being so nice to me? She asked, and her voice was small. Because you deserve kindness, Margaret said simply. Whatever happened before doesn't change that. Something broke inside Grace then, and tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her face with one hand while the other gripped the sheet. Samuel and Margaret stood silently and gave her space to cry, and after a few moments Grace wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be, Margaret said firmly. Now come on and let's get you taken care of. Margaret led Grace into the house while Samuel took care of his horse, and when he came inside 20 minutes later, he could hear water running in the bathroom, and Margaret was in the kitchen stirring a pot on the stove. She's in bad shape, Sam, Margaret said quietly. I know, Samuel said. Did she tell you anything? No, and she doesn't have to, and we'll just help her heal, and that's all. Samuel nodded and sat down heavily at the kitchen table, and Buster wandered over and put his gray muzzle on Samuel's knee, and Samuel scratched behind the old dog's ears. I couldn't just leave her there, he said. Of course you couldn't, Margaret replied. You're a good man, Samuel Cooper, and Eleanor always said so. The mention of his wife made Samuel's chest tighten the way it always did, but he smiled a little. She would have brought Grace home too, he said. Probably would have brought home half the county if we'd let her, Margaret said with affection in her voice. They sat in comfortable silence while the stew bubbled and the sun set outside the windows and turned. The sky orange and pink. Grace emerged an hour later wearing one of Margaret's dresses, and it hung a bit loose on her thin frame, and her hair was wet and combed back, and her feet were bare and clean. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked, uncertain. Come sit down, honey, Margaret said. The stew is ready and you need to eat. Grace moved slowly to the table and sat in the chair farthest from Samuel, and he understood and got up to pour himself coffee and gave her space. Margaret set a bowl of stew in front of Grace along with fresh bread and butter, and Grace stared at the food like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Go ahead, Margaret encouraged. Eat as much as you want, and there's plenty more. Grace picked up the spoon, with a trembling hand, and took a bite and then another. And then she was eating steadily, and Samuel and Margaret exchanged a look that said she'd been hungry for more than just a day or two. They ate together in near silence and tea.